welcome then everybody to this meeting of the Enterprise, Environment and Infrastructure Committee of Perth Kinross Council. I would remind everybody that to use their microphones in particular, and make sure that all mobile phones and other communication devices are in silent mode. Better do that myself. A few items of housekeeping. If the fire alarm sounds, everyone should leave the building using the nearest emergency exit. There are no planned fire alarm tests today, so it would be real. And can I remind officers, members of the public and elected members that today's meeting will be recorded, for which purposes I will therefore introduce people sitting up next to me. My name is Colin Stewart. I'm the convener of the committee. On my left is Director Renton, the Executive Director of the Environment Service. Councillor Purvis is the Vice Convener of the committee, and Mr Young is from the Environment Service, and on my right, Christina Flynn and Danny Williams from Committee Services. If we therefore move on to the apologies for absence for today's meeting. Are there any apologies for absence? I have two notified. Councillor Simpson is substituting for Vice Convener Barnacle, who offers his apologies, and Councillor Illingworth is substituting for Councillor Baiglie. Are there any more apologies?
We also have apologies from Councillor Reid.
Councillor Reid. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest in respect of the business on the agenda today? Nope. We'll then move on to item 3 on the agenda, the minutes of previous meetings. We have the minute of the meeting of the Environment, Enterprise and Infrastructure Committee of the 8th of November 2017. Can we agree the minute of that meeting? Agreed. Thank you. And can we note the minute of the meeting of the Executive Subcommittee of the Environment, Enterprise and Infrastructure Committee of the 25th of October 2017? Noted? Don't need to sign that one. Okay. Item 4 on the agenda then, the Auchterarder Community Facilities Fund. I'm going to ask Councillor Purvis to speak to this report.
Thank you, Convener. This report gives details of the fund, which was set up to mitigate the impact of major expansion to Auchterarder that it would have on community facilities in the local area. The Auchterarder Expansion Development Framework was adopted by the former Enterprise and Infrastructure Committee in September 2014 and requires a £1,000 developer contribution for each house sold on the open market, which was secured through Section 75 legal agreements. The report sets out that £155,000 in contributions have been received by developers. As per the procedures agreed by the Enterprise and Infrastructure Committee in 2016, the views of the Community Council, local elected members and the convener of the Environment and Infrastructure Committee will be sought as to whether each funding request meets the defined criteria. If general agreement is reached, the Executive Director Environment will approve the application and one such proposal has already been agreed for a contribution to the Provost's Walk. The outstanding balance of the fund is now £105,000 and full details of the contributions received and expenditure made is detailed in Appendix 1. The committee is asked today to request that the Executive Director Environment publish an annual report providing details of funding received and allocated, bring forward any application for funding of more than £50,000 for consideration at this committee, and to bring forward a second annual report on the operation of the fund in 12 months' time. Do we have any questions on the report? Councillor Donaldson.
My question, I've never had a clear and logical answer to this, coherent answer to this. It's a question about equity and about fairness across Perth and Kinross. So I want to ask, is this the only such fund in Perth and Kinross, and if so, why?
Mr. Marshall.
At the moment, it is the only such fund in this form. From time to time in assessing planning applications, there are contributions received to other forms of community facilities. However, this one is different in that in dealing with the Auchterarder Master Plan framework discussions in the mid-2000s, it was identified there was a number of potential impacts from the expansion of Auchterarder which were going to materialise as time developed. It was impossible at that time to quantify and cost them precisely. So rather than have direct planning conditions or Section 75 requirements to contribute to a core path in a particular location or a particular improvement to the facility, it was agreed the best way forward in this case was to collect a sum of money which, from the best estimates at the time, would be adequate to address some of the impacts identified from that development. And there were some clear areas where there were deficits in the local infrastructure in Auchterarder. One of the areas that was identified was the Ayton Hall, which at the time was in a poor condition. Subsequent, it received funding through as a legacy from the G8 summit. So there was a range of issues that weren't quantified, and this was felt to be the best way to go forward. We are in the process of negotiating for another settlement at the moment, which is going to see significant expansion. And I think that will come forward through the planning applications in the Section 75 for that. Again, it's an area where there's a clear deficit in infrastructure within that area, and I would say it's the Stanley area we're looking at is towards community facilities. Also, in this case, it was the circumstances were that there was a consortium of developers taking forward the proposal, so it was trying to get equity between the three different planning applications. The final thing I would emphasise is that contributions can only be obtained where there is an identified deficit in the community infrastructure that is going to be impacted upon by the development. And under the legislation we have to operate, we can only collect a fair and proportionate contribution towards that infrastructure deficit. So for example, if there is already a deficit in the community, for example in playing fields, and the deficit was 2 playing fields, but the additional development was going to require a 3rd playing field, we could only seek the contributions towards the 3rd playing field being the additional impact of the development. So I hope that helps.
Does that answer your question, Councillor?
No, supplementary.
Yep, supplementary.
I hear what you say about Stanley, and obviously that's going to come later. But I do, I've heard from your answer about deficits in infrastructure. I do think of other areas such as Kinross, Scone, and obviously Crieff. And it's just to ask, do you perceive that there aren't the similar deficits in infrastructure in Crieff when we are talking of building, excluding social housing, approximately 500 houses over coming years, both in Broich Road and at Tom-Na-Moan?
Mr. Marshall?
With our local development plan that's out for consultation until Friday this week, we have produced infrastructure reports for each of the key settlements, which looks at where there may be potentially some deficits. In some cases, that is covered in the plan by requiring provision of open space. I'll take the example of Blairgowrie. There is a deficit in open space there. One of the sites identifies, I think, if I'm correct, around 4 hectares of new open space to be provided in West Blairgowrie. We also, in various areas, as I'm sure you're aware, collect contributions towards education provision. So where we are aware there is a deficit and it will be exacerbated by the new development, we can look to contributions. Some of these will come through individual contributions on specific planning applications rather than the more strategic approach in Blairgowrie. What we can't do, as I explained earlier, was address deficits that are already there at the moment. It's the same principle as our contributions towards transport infrastructure in the Perth area. Although the total cost of the development is significantly more than we expect to collect through the developer contributions, it's only the proportion, which I think is roughly 39% of the overall cost of the traffic infrastructure, is attributable to new development rather than developments which are already in place in Perth and Kinross, or indeed background traffic growth through the Scottish network.
Councillor Donaldson.
Yeah, final supplementary. Just to clarify then, and I think this is maybe helpful for all of us, where there is an existing deficit, but where new development, new housing development in particular, will accentuate that deficit and make it worse, then you could apply a fund such as this. Needless to say, I'm thinking of, and hopefully we're going to get an announcement reasonably soon on the position with Broich Road, Burrell Street, King Street, and I hope that's going to happen because it's taken quite a long time and it's dragged on. But I'm thinking more in general with developments along that road, the contribution that could be made to other broader community facilities.
Yes, certainly in the case of Broich Road, that is an instance where it's being applied, the contributions towards the roads infrastructure there to the individual developments. They will also, in the case of the residential development, be contributing to education provision. So that is in place there. One thing I didn't mention when I was outlining this applies to capital investment, not the running costs of services. The running costs of services are generally expected to be paid for by the council tax income and the government annual grant aid. So it's purely about the capital.
Thank you. Councillor Robertson, to be followed by Councillor Dugan.
Thanks, Vice Convener. I think both Councillor Donaldson's question and Mr Marshall's reply have been very helpful. The trouble with development, and I think all areas should have access to such a fund. The trouble with development, often when the houses are built, no matter how well they're built, it can have an adverse effect on the quality of life of the residents who currently live there, because of increased traffic, pressure on footpaths and things that, often things that we can't actually foresee. So, my colleague Councillor Purvis and I will know only too well from Kinrossshire that the pressure of development in Kinrossshire is quite severe, and that in turn puts pressure on us and the council to try and put mediation measures in place to try and lessen the effect of that development. So my question is, why can't we have a look at this as I think it's an excellent thing, because I've seen the work that's been done in the Provost Walk in Auchterarder, for example, through this fund. It wouldn't have been done otherwise. I think it's a thing that we should look at for all council wards, to have an additional fund that's available to try and lessen the impact of developments, as we're facing a lot of development in Kinrossshire, for example, and we're going to face a lot of developments in Scone in the near future, and west of Perth. So I think it's a thing that we should actually develop as a council, as a policy. And listening to Mr Marshall's reply, I think it's quite possible, but I just want him to confirm that would be a possibility based on what I've said.
Mr Marshall?
It is a policy in certain circumstances. Another thing I should emphasise is you can only collect contributions where you have the ability to spend them. That may sound a little silly, but so for example, if it was identified there was a deficit in some larger scale facility, and 80% of that deficit was based around the existing population needs and 20% was based around the development. Whilst we could collect that 20%, unless we thought we had the ability within our own capital budget to fund the other 80%, it would be pointless collecting it, because if you don't spend these contributions within a prescribed time period, which is generally either 5 years or 10 years, then you have to hand it back. So there is that slight complication. And I think it would be difficult to develop a general policy for Perth and Kinross, but in looking at each settlement which has significant growth, work could be done to look at the needs of infrastructure development. And that is the purpose of the infrastructure reports which we've developed for the first time this time. If you take the example of roads, and you talked about the additional inconvenience to existing residents from increased traffic, we could only apply the contributions if we felt the road capacity could not take that development, not just inconvenience. And it's about people's perceptions. In Kinross, to be stuck in a queue of 20 cars trying to get onto Station Road may be unacceptable to the public, whereas in other areas might feel it's a bonus day, there's only 20 cars in it. So there is sort of theoretical road capacities that you would have to base your contributions on, not necessarily people's perceptions.
Supplementary?
Yes, thank you. I'm still of the view, based on what your reply has been, that what's been done at Auchterarder can be used as a model for other places. Because even, I know what you're saying about the road capacity and things, but we can often be pressurised and asked for things like a zebra crossing, you know, and there's no funding available for it. And if there's a fund there that we can actually tap into as local members, and it lets the people in our constituencies or wards know that we're actually looking for funding all the time, and these houses are actually bringing extra resources into the neighbourhood, then that's a good thing. So I would ask, both through the convener of the service and yourself, Callum, if that could be possibly looked at as a future way forward.
Well, that's certainly something we can have a look at and have further discussions with Mr Marshall to see if there's something that we can do in other areas. Thank you. Councillor Dugan, to be followed by Councillor Lang.
Thank you, Vice Convener. My question's answered, so but it will just be a comment from me later on.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Dugan. Councillor Lang.
Thanks, Vice Convener. Yes, Stanley is coming forward as the Master Plan of Stanley moves forward. It's been very good to see the way the community has been involved, and they're deciding what they want, and they've been surveyed, and they've put their list of priorities that they would like to see achieved with this fund. Slight concern that we're delegating the powers to, well, 50% of this fund. Just now, I would have thought maybe a smaller proportion of any fund should come to a committee, rather than we're looking at 2 projects there would wipe this fund out.
Is there a particular figure that you would suggest, Councillor Lang?
Well, I suppose it'll all be relative as a percentage rather than a figure, because if you've got a fund of £1 million, 50,000 is only 5%. Yes, I just about got the maths right. But if you've only got a fund of 100,000, it's 50%. So I would think rather than a sum, I think a percentage of what's going to be achieved will be better.
I think we would have to change the policy in order to do that. Perhaps the Director could give more information.
Can I comment, just because I've some knowledge of it, being a local member for Auchterarder?
Councillor Lang.
And the 100,000 isn't the final sum. It's an ongoing.
Yes, I did read the paper and saw what the numbers were, but at the moment,
yes,
you could be looking 10 years down the line. Before all that money's realised. At the moment, it's 50% of the fund.
It is, yeah, but there's no application in at the moment for funding.
Mr Marshall?
I think things will vary between each set of contributions. If I can use the Stanley example, the community has been involved, and it's been great to see them working with the landowners and developers there. And what we have there is a clearly identifiable deficit in facilities. Once that is agreed, it will not come to committee at all because it is for one specific project, and all the community will have to do is prove that that money has been spent on that project, and it will be handed over to them. At least that's the way I'd expect it to work in that case. We did look at, when we presented the report and suggested the £50,000 limit, the needs of communities as well. And I think I'm right in saying in this case, the Auchterarder case, in the £50,000, it was extremely useful that we could do it through consultation with the communities, the community council, the local members and the convener, with the director's approval, and get it out in time, because I think they had a deadline in terms of showing they had the match funding to attract the additional funding. So our committee cycle, and it's not just the every 2 months, it's the lead-in time for the reports, can introduce significant delays, which may have an adverse effect on the community as well. But what I would also say is, for each type of contribution, because we have to justify it, then there should be an idea from the committee, whether that's the Development Management Committee or through this committee, of what the range of items the money can be spent on. So there has been some discussion on what's the eligible expenditure, but I would urge you not to make it too restrictive that could cause delays which may affect the community's aspirations.
I think what I would say, Councillor Lang, obviously the important point here is that local elected members are consulted and the community council is consulted as well. What I would say, though, further to Councillor Robertson's request that Councillor Stewart and I look at the possibility of similar funds being introduced in other areas, that we would also look at the delegation of powers and the amounts that would be done in those situations. Councillor Lang?
Yeah, I agree totally with that, but you missed out the most important part of there where you mentioned elected members and community council. The community should be, and the community council solely does not represent always all the community, so I think we'll have to reach further.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Jarvis.
Excuse me. The policy seems quite restricted. I would ask, do we have the ability to broaden it? Because it would seem to me that if we're tied into only providing this benefit to the new community that are coming in, and there's a need elsewhere, could that money be spent in the other part of whatever the community is? You can follow that.
Mr. Marshall?
It's not suggested that the money for the Auchterarder contribution will be spent on site. In fact, most of the on-site provision within the 3 main development sites will be covered by conditions already. This was for off-site works, which will benefit the larger and wider community. You can't vary it because it has been determined through a Section 75 agreement. I say you can't vary it without the agreement of the signatories to the Section 75 agreement. So it's important you get the criteria right at the beginning, at the outset of the fund.
Supplementary, Councillor Jarvis?
Well, it's just a comment on that. I mean, I wasn't meaning this specific fund. I was meaning for future funds, so that, you know, it could be any money that comes from developers can be spent on the broader community rather than on the community where the funding is raised from.
Thank you.
That wouldn't be legal. You have to have the direct link between the impact of that development and where you want to spend the money. And it's covered by a circular the Scottish Government's produced. What is being suggested, though, in the review of the planning system is a community, not a community levy, an infrastructure levy on a much more broader scale, which would allow us to say our infrastructure requirements for Perth and Kinross are X, Y and Z, and share that out across the whole area. This would also include national infrastructure within it as well, and your infrastructure requirement contributions were required to be approved by the Scottish ministers. So that's in discussion through the new planning bill and might give us a different approach in the longer term and perhaps more flexibility, but we haven't got enough details of that yet.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? I'm happy to move the report. Councillor Lyle, would you like to second it?
Pardon me. The reason this fund was set up because it was going to have a significant impact in Auchterarder. It was never set up as a general fund to be rolled out as a policy across the council. All the local members have been aware of the fund since its inception. We have discussed it numerous times at various committees throughout Auchterarder and the area. The 50,000 contribution to the Provost Walk was discussed at length and, as far as I'm concerned, has been a great success. The next project that comes along, we hope will have more benefits to the centre of Auchterarder, and the general consensus among those local members and local community is that we will try and build this fund so that we can have a significant impact once we start to use it. I am aware that the discussions broadened into the sort of conditions of the LDP2, which is not, this paper is about the Auchterarder Community Fund and the progress we're making with it. In a broader context, we have to be careful that we don't put impediments in the way of developers that are not reasonable. Is the only thing I would say with that. And we are aware that if a development has a significant impact, that conditions should be in the planning approval of the Section 75, and a broader community fund for all developments in Perth and Kinross would require a new policy, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Duggan.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Convener. I think it's been a very interesting debate, and of course Councillor Lyle's absolutely right. We have drifted off just ever so slightly, but nevertheless, my colleague Councillor Robertson, as usual, is absolutely right that there's very rarely a community in Perth and Kinross, or elsewhere for that matter, where there is large-scale applications on the horizon that won't strain those existing amenities within that given community, and we can think, and this has been mentioned, you know, Blairgowrie and Scone, to name just two, and there's more than that just in Perth and Kinross. So there does seem to be always a very negative reaction to housing developments, and whilst Mr Marshall has set out very clearly that this is a carefully governed Section 75 agreement type process where monies can be accrued only in a very distinct way and for very distinct purposes and deployed in a very careful and measured and evidenced way. Taking all that into account, it seems to me that this does offer significant prospects for other communities that are faced by this. I'm sure Councillor Lyle wouldn't suggest for 1 minute that the only community in Perth and Kinross that could ever benefit from such a fund would be Auchterarder, and I don't think that's what he was saying. So I think it's very clear from the views and the questions of the committee today that this is something that the committee, consistent with the terms of the policy, would like to see explored with a little bit more gusto for large developments elsewhere in Perth and Kinross.
Thank you, Councillor Duggan, and I think we've made it clear that we're more than happy to look into this issue further and see how it could benefit other communities. Do you have any further comments? Can we agree the report? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the Public Sector Climate Change Duties Progress Update Report. This report highlights progress made by the Council in accordance with Scottish Government's Public Sector Climate Change reporting process and makes recommendations for further action following submission of the second mandatory report. I'd like to ask Mr Marshall to comment on the give us comments on the report.
Thank you, Convener. As highlighted, this is an annual report which we are required to produce and submit to the Scottish Government as part of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009. This is the second such report that we've submitted. You will note in paragraphs 2.6 there is reference to a table there which is formulated from filling in the Scottish Government matrix about what actions we are taking. and it gives our scores, which show a slight improvement from last year. In the table on, sorry, I think I got the table number wrong there. I think it's table 2.6 shows us in comparison to the Scottish average. Bear in mind that that Scottish average is last year's, and until all the reports are submitted and collated by the Scottish Government, we don't know where other Scottish authorities are. But I would think we will still see that we are ahead of other Scottish authorities in terms of meeting their duties. That is not to say that there are not significant challenges in progressing with the climate change duties, and some of these are identified in paragraph 2.6 to 2.9. Some of the key areas where we need to develop are developing a corporate management plan, improving climate change communications throughout the council, raising awareness on climate change in the communities of Perth and Kinross, and developing a strategic process for assessing climate change risk and opportunities. And again, a risk assessment process to look at future projects. This in part has been addressed by a report that was submitted in September to this committee, which set out some of the challenges coming forward under the Scottish Government's new climate change plan, and set up a corporate board to try and pull together the different strands of council work. So we're already taking action on that. We also in that report highlighted the emerging energy planning issues that the council is about to find we have statutory duties to deliver on. Some of the key issues that we need to address is to calculate the impact of this new legislation. And I should say the climate change targets set by the government are going to be increased if the legislation is passed. I think they're due to be laid before Parliament next month. The recommendations ask the Director to take forward the actions identified in 2.7 to 2.9, and for the Council to identify and deliver a public event to support the Climate Action Week towards the autumn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Are there any questions on the report? Councillor Simpson, followed by Councillor Parrott.
Thank you, Convener. I've been unable to do my usual amount of homework, only having found out I was coming today after our conversation outside the pub in Scone last night at 9:30. But enough of that, perhaps. My question is to the table referred to by Mr. Marshall, page 26. I think we would all agree that average is not really good enough, and I would hope that we would be at the forefront with all this. But when we did improve, we seem to have improved the behaviour. I just wonder if I can give some idea of how we did improve that behaviour. Was there sticks involved or carrots, or what did we actually do?
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. For the benefit of the record, we were actually at a community meeting which was being held in a public venue last night. Mr. Marshall.
In terms of behaviour, some of the actions have been looking at trying to spread the impact, spread knowledge of the impact of climate change with communities and what they could do to help address it, but also in terms of our own communications within the council. And as I've said, setting up the climate low carbon board under the director's chairmanship is one of the actions which will contribute to it. I should say that it's a very complicated sort of matrix that the government asks questions on, and I have to admit it's a complete mystery how the scores come out the end of that matrix.
Thank you, Mr Marshall. Is that all right, Councillor Simpson? Councillor Parrott, you were next. And then we'll go to Councillor Forbes.
I think my question has in part been answered already, but I'm very worried about the prospect of a matrix where the scores seem to appear by magic at the end as opposed to any logic. But am I right in thinking then that the actions proposed at Para 2.7 are mainly seeking to address our relatively low score against our others under behaviours? If they are, then I understand those terms better than I thought, perhaps. But equally, the one area where we seem to be below the Scottish average is on emissions. And do we have any concrete actions proposed to raise our level there to above the Scottish average? Thank you. Mr Marshall.
You're right. In 2.7, a number of the actions, particularly points 2 and 3 and 4 are related to behaviour. In terms of emissions, our major contribution to emissions will be the construction of the Cross Tay Link Road, which will reduce congestion and result in loss of emissions. Also, in terms of emissions, it's looking at the impact of development in Perth and Kinross on emissions, not necessarily the emissions in Perth and Kinross. Now, if I can explain the difference there, is in using our electricity here, hopefully it's coming from a nice clean wind farm, but it may be coming from a higher carbon source of energy. So it's about reducing the energy footprint of Perth and Kinross. Then you will reduce the emissions that Perth and Kinross is responsible for. So it's a little bit more complex than just our emissions. And one of the key actions around that is coming through the emerging legislation, which requires us to prepare local heat and energy efficiency strategies. And we are currently one of 11 pilot projects funded through the government SEEP 2 pilot scheme, and also supported by the Cities Alliance to develop a local heat and energy efficiency plan for the Muirton going round to Inverarmond area of Perth, which I say is a pilot. This will be looking to help both householders and businesses reduce their energy consumption and to convert them to low carbon forms of energy. It may also look at the issues such as district heating within the areas where there is the most potential, or in fact looking at direct wire feeds in terms of electricity. So there is activities in that front which we hope will bear fruit in terms of emissions. It is a long-term programme though. This is one small part of Perth and Kinross that we're tackling, and so it'll be interesting to see the results of that.
Thank you, Mr Marshall. Supplementary, Councillor
Just a short supplementary. I've seen that the developer at Bertha Park is planning to install electric vehicle charging points on all properties built there. Am I right in assuming then that will count as a plus towards our scores in this matrix?
Mr Marshall.
Yes, the greater sustainability of the developments, the better. And what they are doing in doing this, it helps them achieve what they call a silver standard in terms of sustainability for their buildings. And our policy framework, which is already fed into this, is seeking that. What Springfield are doing in this case is they're saying this is one of the ways we are going to do it. In another development, which is approved roundabout now, they will have to achieve the same standards. They may choose to do it by applying solar panels on their house, higher levels of insulation, or some other method. So there can be different methods. The instance with Springfield is welcome, but it's their way of meeting the existing policy framework.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Marshall. Councillor Forbes next, followed by Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Convener. I have a couple of questions. They're both pretty simple, so if it's okay, I'll put them both in together. 2.6 says the reason we're slightly behind Scottish average is largely due to the lack of a carbon management plan, and then coincidentally 2.7, number 1 is to develop a carbon management plan. I just wondered if we had a timescale for that. It may be in the report and I may have missed it, but I'm not sure. And my second question, largely my idle curiosity really, section 2.10, the range is given as from below 90 to 95% of 1990 levels, and that just seems a very broad range. I wondered if there was a reason for that.
Mr. Marshall.
The target levels are set by the Scottish Government in their climate change legislation. It is a very ambitious target. I'm not entirely sure the logic of that specific target, just that we know it is ambitious. It will be very hard to achieve. Sorry, the first question slipped me.
The first question was about the timescale for the carbon management.
Oh yeah, the timescales. We would intend to start work on it this year. We are not quite clear how long it will take to develop yet. And the two things are, first, it's a new project for us and a new area of work developing this. And the second will be reflected on what happens in a report that's going to SP&R, the next committee, about the priorities for supplementary guidance. If that report is approved in its form, we expect to put the relevant people on to working on this towards the summer of this year. And one of the first issues will be scoping out the amount of work, having discussions with various of the statutory agencies that will be involved as well, and try to get a project plan and timetable for it. However, if there is a change to the priorities for supplementary guidance, then that might affect the programme. So we'd expect to come forward with a report on the issue and how we're going to develop it at some point later this year.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you.
And Councillor Johnson and then Councillor Waters.
First of all, I failed to thank Peter Marshall for the very detailed responses he gave on the earlier section. Can I follow up, Councillor Parrott, with a question on emissions? It's very specific, and it's on air quality as well, because the problem is not just in central Perth. I know there's work being done on this. Can I ask very specifically, what is the timeline for the production of an air quality action plan for Crieff?
Mr. Marshall. Oh, I beg your pardon. Director Renton.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Donaldson. I believe it's this year.
But could I just say my earlier indications had been it would be earlier this year. It now could be delayed somewhat.
I don't know. I would have to check, but you know, sort of the team are actively working on it, so we would hope to have it as early this year as possible.
Yeah, because I know there has been a bit of work done in, and it's a real issue to people, Crieff, and particular problems in the High Street.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you both, Councillor Waters and then Councillor Lane.
Thank you, Convener. Just a question on the table on page 27. We're doing, I assume the idea of the table was to do a comparison between Perth and Kinross and the Scottish Local Authorities average. I don't know, this may be a typo, but why are we comparing our results for 16 and 17 against a Scottish average for 15 and 16? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Waters, for the question. The answer is that the latest available figures for the Scottish average are the 2015-16 numbers. Until all of the reports from the individual local authorities have been submitted and averaged out, the 2016-17 numbers aren't available. Is that okay?
A quick supplementary. Do we know with the Scottish, we've had very minimal change. Do we have a rough idea? Are the changes across Scotland similar, minimal, or has been big, larger improvements elsewhere, or we don't have that information yet?
Mr. Marshall.
I can't give you an authoritative answer on that until we see the results. But what I would say is, from the working we're doing through the Cities Alliance and with other forums through Heads of Planning Scotland on this, I would say we are still further ahead than the majority of authorities. And certainly in certain areas. And I was at a meeting last week with the Cities Alliance. Sorry, not the Cities Alliance. It was all the Cities Alliance authorities that are progressing the seat pilot schemes organised by the Scottish Government, with the other authorities, 11 in total. And it was quoted by the government and by a number of other agencies that we were further ahead on that work than other authorities. So I think we are developing ahead of other authorities. But don't hide the fact there is still a long way to go there in terms of meeting the targets, the very ambitious targets that are being set by the Scottish Government. But you have to put that in context as well, is that Scotland is actually held up on a European scale as being ahead of the game of most other European countries. A number of European countries are coming to see how the Scottish Government's tackling climate change. So I think there is a good news story there, but it's a big challenge for the future.
Thank you.
Councillor Lang.
Thanks. It's just points 2.8 and 2.9. Back in September, there were recommendations approved and key issues were raised. I was just wondering if we could have an update on how far developed these recommendations are at this stage.
Director Renton.
Okay. I'll make a start to answering the question, and then Peter will come in. You know, sort of, we have already, you know, sort of established and, you know, sort of chaired, you know, sort of one meeting of the cross-council project board. But there's been team meetings. You know, we have got a number of officers below that level, you know, sort of, who have been meeting to discuss it, and there will be another board meeting, I think, within the next couple of weeks to take that forward. From then, we will be able to develop a much clearer and focused action plan, which at some point we would be coming back and engaging with elected members on, in terms of one of the other recommendations from that report.
Mr. Marshall.
If I can just add, as I mentioned, the new Climate Change Act is going to be lodged in Parliament next month. And I think the appropriate time for things like the member training is where we've got a clear idea of what the legislation and the duties that are going to fall on local authorities are. We did in part that in terms of the report last September, warning you of what was likely to be coming forward, but we'd hope to develop more in detail training as we go forward. And I'm also involved in the Scottish Government COSLA Scottish Energy Efficiency Programme working group, and making the point to government that this needs to be done across all local authorities, and hopefully there will be some coordination from the Scottish Government in terms of rolling out the training and knowledge awareness, not just to yourselves as members, but to officers within the council and the public in general. There's little point in 32 authorities all developing this individually.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Are there any more questions on the report? No. In that case, I'd like to formally move the report, and in doing so, recognise both the challenges and opportunities presented by climate change and our consequent duties, both statutory and indeed our wider responsibilities to stewardship of the environment and to future generations. And I'd like to make clear that this administration, and I trust this whole council, are committed to rising to those challenges. Okay, are there any comments on the report? Can we agree the report? Thank you. Item 6 on the agenda then, proposed additional green routes. I'd like to ask Councillor Purvis to lead the discussion on this item.
Thank you, Convener. This paper asked the committee to proceed with the introduction of 4 new green routes, which were brought forward at the Environment, Enterprise and Infrastructure Committee in June last year. The routes are shown in appendices 2 to 5. and are between Bridgeavon and Glenfarg, between Glenfarg and Milnathort, between Rattray and Ayleth, and from Kirkton Road, Old Mill Road to Ashgrove Road to Westmill Farm in Rattray. The Green Routes programme has been very successful, and the lower speed limits and signage that has been introduced in these areas have helped to make these routes more attractive for both cyclists and walkers alike. The green routes that have already been introduced can be seen in Appendix 1 of the report. There has been one objection in relation to these routes, and that is specifically in relation to the route between Glenfarg and Milnathort. The committee is asked to set this objection aside. The details of it can be seen in the report, and proceed with the introduction of this and the 3 other green routes. I think this has been a very successful programme, and I hope that all members can support it. Do we have any questions on the report? Councillor Duggan.
Thank you, Vice Convener. It's the Kirkton Road in Rattray, which I think, I'm just trying to find it now, is on Appendix 5. It's just really, I accept there's probably a limit to what we can do. I see these routes are between 30 and 40 miles per hour. That particular route you'd be really ambitious to be doing 15 miles an hour on that road. So my question is, why is that 40 and not 30?
Mr. Cargill?
Councillor Duggan. The Kirkton Road request came in from pretty much from the local community and the Cooperangus Cycle Hub, who we've been dealing with in the last couple of years. And the aspiration is, as you see at the bottom of that plan there, the U104, where that heads eastwards, is that the group in Cooperangus are actively working on an agreement with a landowner there to make connection through to another public road to allow us to continue on to Ayleth. You're absolutely right that the speed limit is very low there. It's been suggested that it should be 40, and we're comfortable with that. But if you wish us to consider, we're happy to do so. But that would all come out in the consultation exercise when we would receive requests and suggestions from the community. And if there are suggestions for it to be a lower speed limit, then we would be bound to come back to committee.
Councillor Duggan.
Vice Convener, that's helpful. I mean, it's for the community to decide. It's just, 60 on that road would be notional. 40 is also notional. 30 would be a bit closer to what your absolute maximum would ever be. It's just about making sense of it.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Nope. Well, I'm happy to move this report. Do you have any comments on the report? Councillor Robertson.
I'll just make a brief comment to say that I think the green routes were originally trialled in Kinrossshire, and Mr Cargill is a very popular person in Kinrossshire because of the number of green routes he's managed to put through, and evidence of that is that more communities are coming forward with suggestions for additional green routes, and we're actually building up a number of cycling and walking networks in various communities, and I think it's a very good indication of the way this council is moving forward. And we were talking about greenhouse emissions, then this is evidence of our work in trying to prevent more greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Robertson. Councillor Simpson.
I wouldn't like to be outdone in praising Mr Cargill. He's very popular in Cooperangus as well. Indeed, I spend most of my time at council meetings where councillors and council officers are particularly unpopular. Just my comment, this is a great good news story which we should be getting out there, and this is in fact even part of our carbon reduction, because obviously cycling is the answer to most questions, as you all know, and we should be encouraging it more, and I hope that we can look forward to a rollout of more and more of these green routes, because it's a good news story.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Simpson. Do you have any further comments? Councillor Stewart?
It's just it was just to add to Mr Cargill's praise of the Cooperangus cycling hub, and Councillor Simpson's as well. The development of the Strathmore cycle network is ongoing, but it's an excellent example of both community resilience and self-reliance, and I have nothing but praise for their work.
Thank you, Convener. Can we agree the report? Agreed. Right, we'll now move on to paper 7, which is on disabled persons parking places, variations order. The Council has a statutory duty to keep the disabled persons parking places order under review, and the report today proposes a number of additions and removals of disabled parking bays in Perth and Kinross. The specific proposed additions and removals are detailed in Appendix 1 of the report. The additions are to meet the requirements of new applicants who meet the criteria for a blue badge and who have requested a disabled space close to their property. The removals are in places where disabled bays are no longer required due to a change of circumstances, such as when a blue badge holder has moved. The committee is asked to approve the proposal set out in Appendix 1 and to allow officers to start the formal process of varying the traffic regulation order, which requires a statutory consultation. Any objection received will be brought back to this committee with the appropriate recommendations. Do you have any questions on this report? I'll move it. Do you have any comments? Nope. Can we agree the report? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Purvis. We'll move on to item 8 on the agenda, amendments to the list of public roads. The report before us recommends that the list of public roads be updated to account of the additions detailed in the appendix to the report. Are there any questions on the report? No questions. I'll move the report. Can we agree it? Or any comments? Agreed? Okay. Thank you very much. Item 9 on the agenda is the proposed 30-mile-an-hour speed limits at Caputh. So we've now got a series of we've got two. Well, we'll take them separately because I see a hand coming up. So this is a proposal to extend the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit at Caputh. Are there any questions on the report? Councillor Lang.
Comment.
Well, I'll formally, if we've got no questions, I'll formally move it and then we'll move to comments. Comments then, Councillor Lang.
Thank you, Convener. It's just to say that this will be welcomed by the community. It's good to see that the community actually did a survey of the whole village and everybody responded. There was a package of measures that they wished to see put in place to improve the safety of the driving through that village, as the roads split it in many ways. And it's good to see that this is the first piece of the jigsaw coming forward. So they'll be very well. It's very welcome. Thanks.
Okay, if there are no further comments, can we agree the report? Item 10 on the agenda, the proposed 30-mile speed limits at the B898. Do we have any local members who can guide me on the pronunciation of what I'm going to try as Inchmagrannachan? Oh, thanks. Shucks. Do we have any questions on the report? Question, Councillor Lang. We'll move to comments after I've moved the report. If there are no questions, right, I'm happy to move the report. Comment, Councillor Lang.
Thanks. This will be very welcome. There was a tragic accident in Inchmagrannachan about 10 years ago where there was a young cyclist was fatally injured. So, and Inchmagrannachan has grown. It's if we'll talk percentages, it's probably 100% bigger than it was 10 years ago. I think there's been 4 more houses or 5 more houses built. So, yeah, it's very welcome. It's a dangerous piece of road because a lot of tourists, etc., use it, and it comes on you very quickly around the corner. So, thanks very much for this.
Okay, obviously the primary driver or primary reason for introducing 30-mile-an-hour speed limits is to improve road safety. So thank you for your comments, Councillor Lang. Are there any other comments, or can we agree the report? Agreed. We're going to move on then to item 11 on the agenda, the proposed variation to waiting restrictions at the Wicks Baiglie Road in Bridge of Erne. Are there any? I'm going to just move this report. Are there any questions and take questions and comments at the same time? Are there any questions or comments? No? Can we agree the report then? Thank you very much. Item 11, no, beg your pardon, item 12, the proposed variation to waiting restrictions at Tom-Na-Moan Road in Pitlochry. I'll just move the report. And are there any questions or comments on this report? No. Can we agree the report? Thank you very much. Item 13, the proposed variation to waiting restrictions on Abbot Street in Perth. I'll move the report and invite any questions or comments. Councillor Dugan. Oh. A very welcome.
I'm so enthusiastic for this development that I feel the need to tell you how very welcome this will be.
Thanks very much, Councillor Dugan. Can we agree the report? Last item on the agenda then, the proposed variation to waiting restrictions at Ruthvenfield Place in Perth. I'll move the report and invite any questions or comments at the same time. No. Can we agree this report? Agreed. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your attendance and for your intelligent questions and comments during the meeting.